R number 4, this video, like the others, is in a series of my 5 R's as a roadmap to how you fix a cell, how you detox a cell. Look, ultimately, this is the answer to why people still don't feel well, why you still don't feel well, and perhaps even why you can't lose weight. When we look at why people don't get well today, this really is a cellular issue. And if you've watched my videos, you've heard me say this. The real reason for weight loss resistance is a hormone reason. However, we have to back it up even further into a cellular issue. So in this series of my 5 R's, we are examining the 5 R's as I teach it to doctors around the country, around the world, of what they need to do to fix the cell to get people well. And that's my mantra, right? If you don't fix the cell, you won't get well. R number 1, and again, I'll just briefly go through them, but you need to go back and watch these videos in their entirety. R number 1 is removing the source. And in that video, I talk about the 3 big sources upstream that most people miss. And I have practitioners that find me from all over the world people that have been to practitioners from all over the world. And they go to these docs and they miss it. They miss these glaring upstream issues. And it is, in fact, why they still aren't well. R number 2 is regenerating the cell membranes. And without recapping the whole video, I'll just say this. You can't turn off genes that have been triggered if you don't fix the membranes. You can't detox the cell if you don't fix the membranes. And you can't build cell energy up if you don't fix the cell membranes. And that leads to R3, because we need cell energy to ultimately run every function of the cell, including detox. And I talked about the Gibbs free energy equation. And what that means is as energy goes down in a cell, so does something called glutathione. And that's the cell's part of the ability to detox itself. And then inflammation goes up. So we need to rebuild cellular energy, but we can't do that unless we fix the membranes. And remember, every video I'm giving you dietary strategies as well as biohacks and things you can start right away with every one of these videos. Tonight's will be no different. All right, it brings me to R4, which is, I think, the obvious. It is reducing inflammation of the cell. Now, I say that's the obvious because if you've watched the news, read the headlines, inflammation is the cause of all disease, they say, right? Even cancer, diabetes, thyroid conditions, hormone conditions, inflammation. But the difference is this. You may think of inflammation as your sore shoulder or knee, which that is inflammation. But I'm referencing inflammation of your cell membranes. That is really the key. And we talked about regenerating cell membranes in R2. But inflammation of the cell, just more generally, is what really is the problem and why it's linked to so many different diseases. Okay, so when we look at a cell that becomes inflamed, and you know I love to draw cells in circles. So if this is our cell, toxins are the number 1 thing that drive inflammation. But I'm going to give you 2 others. Increase in glucose in the standard diet that most people are eating is a driver of inflaming the cell membrane. Of course, toxins come in and bind to this fatty membrane because, see, the membranes are made of what is called a lipid bilayer. That's 2 layers of fat. So the toxins come in and they get into these membranes. And by the way, they get into all of the membranes. So there's inner membranes, and this is the mitochondria. That's where you make energy. The nuclear membrane, this is where your fragile DNA is. So what happens is when these membranes become inflamed, it becomes a problem to making cell energy, turning on bad genes. But ultimately, this outer membrane determines what comes into the cell and ultimately the toxins that need to come out. So the inflamed membrane becomes a problem. So the bottom line is that we have to reduce the inflammation. And again, I'm going to give you tricks to do that even now. But it is the inflammation driven by toxins as well as elevations in glucose, in insulin, standard American diet, right? Eating a lot of processed foods. And lastly, certain fats. If you're not looking for vegetable oils and canola oils in your diet, these fats come into the membrane and they displace the good fats. And these particular fats are omega-6 fats. The omega-6 fat is really the fat, I talked about this in R2 video, is the determining fat of the function and the health of the membranes. So we don't want to displace those fats, but we need to avoid the bad fats. So 3 things that drive inflammation: bad fats, and again, go back and watch R2, elevations of glucose and insulin, standard American diet, and toxins being the #1 driver. Okay, so what we can do right away in your diet, I think it's the obvious. We can avoid the bad fats. We can reduce glucose and insulin spikes by eating a more healthy diet. And again, I think for this video's sake, I don't need to get into processed food, white breads, white rice, white sugars, white anything is going to basically spike up the glucose. And again, it's glucose spikes that really can drive the inflammation. But we're building a case that toxins are the #1 driver. Matter of fact, there was a gentleman named Otto Warburg at the turn of the 19th century, and he determined that toxins disrupt the membrane of the mitochondria, and that is one of the big things that drives cancer. So we know toxins disrupts the membrane by driving inflammation. I want to make another point, because obviously there's a lot of people with hormone dysregulation. I talked a little bit about this in R2, but on every cell there are hormone receptors. Your hormones have to bind to these receptors, whether it's insulin, okay, whether it's estrogen, or whether it's thyroid hormone. When they bind to these receptors, you feel good. You burn fat as an energy source. You stay lean. You have great energy. All of that happens. However, when inflammation comes in and blunts these receptors, now it doesn't matter what your hormones do out here. So what happens is the blood level of hormones could be improved by taking hormones. But the fact is, unless you can get the message in the cell, then you don't feel well. So therefore, we have to reduce the inflammation ultimately to get the hormones connected to the receptor and get their message in the cell. Okay, so besides the obvious that I already stated, what can you do? I'd love to give you little tips on biohacks. Red light therapy is something that's been talked about. It's new. Well, if you look at this, if I turn this on, I doubt you can see it, but there's a slight red glaze. See that redness in there? Okay, that's near infrared. You can't see with the human eye. That little bit of red tint you're seeing is other wavelengths of red light. But near infrared in particular goes into the cell. It can bypass those cell membranes and go right into the mitochondria where you make energy. Now remember what I said. We need energy to detox the cell. The Gibbs free energy equation is, if we can raise energy, which red light therapy does, we can raise glutathione, which helps detox the cell, and we can ultimately reduce inflammation of the cell, and that's the goal in this video. So this is a few $100. Of course, they have much bigger units, which I have. This one I travel with. This one you can use on specific places, but at night, using it right on the back of the head is a way to get better sleep, deep sleep and REM sleep, but it also is another way of raising your cellular inflammation. There's something called pulsed electromagnetic frequency, which is another way of bypassing in the cell and raising energy. So now today we have different modalities that we can start right away. I call them biohacks to raising your cellular energy by reducing the inflammation. So again, if we can increase the inflammation of the cell, ultimately we're going to reduce the inflammation. All right, the dietary trick. The dietary trick, I know, I told you to just eat a healthy diet, stay away from processed foods, but let me be a little more specific. Back here, Beyond Fasting, it's my book. Fasting is the most powerful way to reduce inflammation. Let me tell you a story. My son, just 4 months ago, broke his back. And in that, he should have been dead. He jumped off a 60-foot cliff and hit about 50 feet down, literally on rock. So you can imagine. Of course, he broke some bones, but the most important bones that he broke were two spinal bones, which is T10 and T11. And there was a lot of other things broken as well. But most people, 75% of the people with this particular fracture, in fact end in paralysis. He didn't. So I thank God for the miracle right there. And that was, in fact, the first miracle. He should have been dead or paralyzed. He was neither. However, what can happen is inflammation can occur over days, and we can start to cause spinal cord damage and other problems. The first thing we did was fast. Why? Because in a fasting state, there's something called autophagy. Autophagy means that the body, to get energy when you're not eating, will eat the bad stuff first. So we see a massive reduction in inflammation. So that's why we fasted him for about 4.5 days, and most extended fasts to reduce inflammation are about 5 days. Something else happens during a fast, that when you eat the bad cells and the debris, as we say, due to inflammation oftentimes, what happens is we stimulate a stem cell, and that stimulates more healing and can also help downregulate inflammation. All of the inflammation markers that we know are causative factors in inflammation reduced during a fasting state. So what can we do in our days? Well, what I do is I have 2 or 3 days a week where I only eat one meal. So I'm fasting for 23, 24 hours. So I have a decrease in inflammation just generally on a weekly basis. And of course, 4 times a year, and even one fast a year, a longer fast, maybe 5-day fast a year, reduces inflammation enough even to decrease cancer risk. So ultimately, I believe our DNA is set up to fast. We are genetically programmed to fast. The problem is today, we're always in a feast state, which actually can increase inflammation. But I believe that without times of fasting, we're missing the opportunity to decrease our inflammation, reset our genes, and actually lower even some of the genes that get turned on that keep inflammation turned on. When we look at really chronic inflammation because inflammation is meant to be there in an acute state, meaning it happens to upregulate immunity. But when it stays long, chronic inflammation, that's where we run into chronic disease and problems. So I believe by just throwing in periodic weekly fasts where you eat just one meal, no, you don't have to do it every week, but periodically, it's going to turn off some of these genes that get turned on that upregulate inflammation. And if you throw in 1, 2, 3, even 4 fasts a year, watch what happens. Now you truly turn down the inflammation knob. So imagine us all having an inflammation knob that our standard living, stressful living, chemicals, toxins, glucose spikes, everything I already mentioned, bad fats. It turns it up. How do we turn the dial down permanently so we don't end up with one of the chronic diseases that we know is in fact driven by inflammation? I believe fasting is the best tool, the sharpest tool in the shed to do that. So weekly fasting, even 1 day a week, eat one meal. On a monthly basis, oftentimes we do 5 days even of what we call a partial fast, where we decrease calories, 5 to 1,000 calories. That's called a partial fast. That works too, and even on a yearly basis. By even doing one fast a year, experts say can decrease cancer up to 95%. Why? Reduces inflammation. So there you have it. Some cool biohacks. Add some red light therapy, a few $100. Add it to your daily regime. I do it almost every day. And you can obviously add the fasting strategies. Pay attention to the fats you eat. Go watch R2 video. Obviously, pay attention to processed foods that spike glucose. And we're getting to the toxic equation. Ultimately, if you don't detox the cell, we can't control inflammation and get well. One more, R5. I'll see you on the next video. This is important. And I'll leave you with this right here. Your DNA is not your destiny. There's something you can do about that. I'll see you on the next video.